Let's begin with a quick look at how gender and class intersect in 20th century feminist movements. We'll focus on feminist movements in what we could loosely call the West, which is basically America and Western Europe.
But why focus specifically on Western feminism? Wouldn't it be more sensible to focus on feminism as a global movement?
Well, of course, Thomas. I mean, women's rights have been fought for around the world for a long time. But they've remained localized to their own countries. So, for instance, in India, during the independence movement over the first half of the 20th century, the first 30 years or so, you had also social reform. So child marriage, widow remarriage, education for women, burning women on the pyres of their husbands, what we call sati.
That sounds excessive.
You would be surprised how logical people thought it was back then, before it was banned. So all of these were movements in India, but they remained in India. They didn't sort of extend out and influence the rest of the world, whereas Western feminism has become dominant. And Western feminist terminology has, for better or for worse, been dominant in much of the 20th century and continues to be so in much of the feminist and gender scholarship that's readily accessible today. These movements have also been influential across the world in a way in which other feminist movements have not, remaining localized in their own country or sphere of action. So, as you might know, these have been called the three waves of feminist movement. And some people are calling the second decade of the 21st century the fourth wave. The suffragette movement of the late 19th and early 20th century in England and the Equal Rights Amendment movement in America are usually seen as the first wave of feminism in these countries.
So as you can see, the struggle for female suffrage lasted almost 100 years. And partly thanks to the colonial influence of England, it spread to countries like New Zealand, Australia, and America, all colonies at the time. The right to vote was not, as you can imagine, a simple political demand. In order to make such a demand, several patriarchal, sexist, even misogynist ideas had to be challenged. Did women have the same intellectual powers as men? Why were women in the streets holding up signs and courting arrest anyway, when they were clearly just supposed to be at home, cooking and looking after babies? Why were women wearing pants? Did they think they were men? Even while women were being beaten and tortured, jailed and sexually assaulted, popular opinion was sought to be swayed by cartoons and speeches in public forums.
The backlash was swift and brutal, painting suffragettes as entitled, privileged, educated, and middle or upper middle class women who merely wanted to abandon their domestic lives and emasculate men by making them take over the duties of the housewife and mother. What does this have to do with class, you might ask? It was entirely true that women fighting for the right to vote were indeed educated and middle or upper middle class women. For instance, most of them were not factory workers or of the working class in general, because women in this position could hardly afford to leave work or lose their jobs. And so they were much more vulnerable and less protected by the privileges of their class.
It's possible to draw the same conclusions from the intersection of gender and class with regard to the movement for the Equal Rights Amendment in America. Interestingly, though, the backlash to this movement and much of the oppositional campaigning came from women rather than men. While it's true that Congress has had a majority of men over the almost 100 years that the Equal Rights Amendment has been tabled, which may be a key reason why it's not been ratified by the required 38 states yet, it's equally true that the voices of opposition have been mostly female, upper class, and privileged, and that their arguments against the amendment consist almost entirely of the threat of the loss of those privileges should the amendment be ratified.
And do you know what those privileges are, Thomas?
No, I don't, Giti, but from the tone of your voice, I suspect it to be absolutely outrageous.
Well, interestingly, you know how these days the big discussion is about gendered bathrooms? Mm-hmm. Well, this was the big threat that was held out way back then at the turn of the 20th century, women would be denied their own bathrooms and have to share unisex bathrooms with men. Of course, bathrooms have nothing to do with equal rights for women, but there you have it. That and the threat that women would be forcibly drafted into the army if the Equal Rights Amendment were to be ratified.
And this worked?
Surprisingly enough, Thomas, yes. Our final signpost for the first wave will be Virginia Woolf, much-loved feminist and torchbearer. In her iconic 1929 text, A Room of One's Own, she makes several important points about the need for financial security for women to be able to write. Yet, of course, in all the many significant and feminist ideas she discusses, it is clear that she is very much enclosed within the confines of the upper middle class, genteel woman, and that any other class of woman is not really part of her struggle. But to discuss these nuances, we'll need another whole course dedicated to Woolf.
Well, it's early days yet. And some might say that the struggle against gender equality was begun by these women, and that the privileges of their class, their education, their social and financial protections were precisely what allowed them to forge these struggles. Now, as we move on to the second wave of feminism, we will look into whether these class biases are being corrected or not.